historic international nuclear deal with Iran could collapse. A key deadline is looming, and all eyes are on the U.S. President Donald Trump, who's never liked the accord. Can the agreement survive if Washington gives it the thumbs down? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abougada. The U.S. President Donald Trump calls it an embarrassment and the worst deal ever. But when Iran and 6 countries reached a nuclear agreement 2 years ago, it was seen as a landmark. And now it could unravel. Well, Trump has to review the deal and decide if Iran is keeping to its end of the bargain and whether it serves U.S. interests. The deadline for him to make that decision is fast approaching. The signatories to the deal say Tehran is complying and they are against scrapping or modifying it. But Trump says Iran is not living up to the spirit of the agreement.
We must not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. The Iranian regime supports terrorism and exports violence, bloodshed, and chaos across the Middle East. That is why we must put an end to Iran's continued aggression and nuclear ambitions. They have not lived up to the spirit of their agreement.
Well, the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani calls those allegations baseless. During last month's UN General Assembly in New York, he warned of a decisive and resolute response if any of the parties violated the deal. And if the U.S. decides to withdraw from the pact, Iran says it could abandon the agreement altogether. So the nuclear deal was signed back in 2015 between Tehran and 6 world powers, the U.S., the U.K., France, China, Russia, and Germany. So what exactly does it involve? Well, it was agreed sanctions against Iran would be lifted in exchange for the government's curbing of its nuclear program. The deal restricts, among other things, the amount of nuclear fuel that Iran can keep for the next 15 years. And prevents its ability to use 2 radioactive materials, uranium and plutonium, to create weapons. Now, to do that, Iran's stockpile of low-enriched uranium had to be reduced by 98% and 2/3 of its installed centrifuges cut. The deal also calls for sanctions to be imposed quickly if the agreement is violated. And inspectors from the UN's nuclear watchdog get access to Iran's nuclear sites anytime. The agreement must be certified by the U.S. president every 90 days, so the next deadline is October 15th. And if Donald Trump doesn't certify it, it'll be up to Congress to decide what to do. Let's bring in our guests. We have Fouad Azadi. He's a professor of world studies at the University of Tehran. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Hilary Mann Leverett, who's a former U.S. State Department official. And from Vienna, Tariq Raouf. He's the former head of the Verification and Security Policy Coordination Office at the International Atomic Energy Agency itself. Welcome to you all. Hilary Mann Leverett, Trump has certified this deal twice before. Why is he now expected to decertify it?
Well, he has made clear through his presidential campaign and since he was inaugurated as president that he has not liked this deal, and his intention was to get out of this deal somehow. He has pushed his national security and foreign policy team since he took office to try to find a way out. The problem for him is that there's not an easy way out. There's no credible alternative to this deal, and there's no problem on the Iranian side. The international agency that is charged with monitoring this deal, the IAEA, has never found a single violation of any credibility from the Iranian side. So that leaves President Trump's team here with very little to work with. They can't cite any technical violations, as they call it, of the agreement. And they don't have an alternative. So up until now, President Trump has essentially been, in his own words, forced to certify Iran's compliance and to continue waiving the sanctions. What we understand is happening now, though, is that his team has somehow come together with a policy that he can choose to adopt, though it's not final. He may not, where he says that this agreement is not in U.S. vital national security interests. He will not cite any real violations by Iran, but just say it's not in U.S. national security interests. and then the Congress would decide whether or not to reimpose sanctions, which would take the United States out of the deal.
We'll talk about a number of issues that you raised in a moment, but first, let me just get the sense from each of my guests about where they think Trump stands when it comes to decertifying this deal. Tariq Raouf, over to you in Vienna. What is your sense of what the president is expected to do on October the 15th?
Well, U.S. media reports suggest that he will decertify Iran. But this will then mean that the United States will be perceived as an unreliable partner. It will be a blow to the UN Security Council because the Iran deal was sanctified by Security Council Resolution 2231. And in the future, countries would be reluctant to make agreements with the United States if they think that successive governments would abandon previously agreed deeds. And this is also contrary to international law of Pacta Servanda, where a state is responsible for living up to its international legal obligations, and these do not change just because there is a change in government.
Just to be perfectly clear, if Trump does indeed decertify this deal, then that doesn't mean that it is the end of the deal for Fuad Azidi. But how is Tehran looking at all of this?
It's generally difficult to get Iranians, Americans, and Europeans on the same page. And the nuclear agreement was an instant that this actually happened. And as you have been watching the reactions, we have former Obama officials, Obama administration officials, writing op-ed pieces, going on television shows, defending the nuclear agreement. In Iran, President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif are doing basically the same thing. They worked very hard in their recent visit in New York to save the deal. So there is a consensus basically among Iranians, Europeans, and most American observers of Iran and Middle East politics that this is a good agreement. The problem that we have is Donald Trump's promise during campaign to tear up the nuclear agreement, and then we have a small minority of Iran hawks that don't like the agreement. And what they are planning to do, apparently, is to have it both ways, basically, to have sanctions, to have more sanctions, and then at the same time not technically violate the agreement, so they will have restrictions on Iran's nuclear program. And this is not going to be good news for Iranian officials that accepted the agreement. The idea behind the agreement was to reduce sanctions, not to increase sanctions.
And do Iranians, though, feel like this could be the beginning of the unraveling of the deal for Fuad Azadi?
Yes, I think so, because no Iranian politician can justify putting severe restrictions on Iran's nuclear program and at the same time get a new sanctions law every week. So this is going to be difficult for Iranian officials to continue with, and I think this is going to put the nuclear agreement in serious jeopardy.
Hillary, what's the strategy behind pushing the ball to Congress?
The strategy is in some ways not so coherent, and I think not readily understandable for those outside of Washington. It's not, in fact, as a priority to reimpose sanctions on Iran. What the strategy is to build essentially a united front between the White House and Congress to work with the Europeans to build in a pretext to force Iran to commit some sort of violation of either the deal or of a European-U.S. consensus. Now, that may seem strange, but they've made some significant progress with that. What the Trump administration has done is they've really kept Congress at bay, telling them we don't want to reimpose sanctions right now, so you don't have a big call from Congress to reimpose sanctions. And then you've seen the Trump administration work very hard and very closely with, in particular, the French, but also the British, in particular with French President Macron, to try to figure out, is there a way that they could have what they would call a supplemental agreement? The United States could call it renegotiating the agreement, and the Europeans can call it a supplement that would address other issues which the United States wants to bring out, like Iran's missile program, like Iran's support for groups such as Hezbollah and others, other things that have long been on the U.S. list of what they may describe as concerns about Iranian behavior. The point of that, though, would be to push Iran to not accept it and for Iran to be the one that collapses the nuclear deal. That's essentially what the strategy is coming forward, and I think will be unveiled next week, though, of course, President Trump can decide anything at the last minute, as he's wont to do.
So what you're saying is that the Trump administration is looking to challenge Iran on a number of other fronts without breaking the nuclear agreement?
Yes, and two principal ways: to gain consensus with the Europeans, to add additional areas with which to force Iran to negotiate on the ballistic missile program and on Iran's support for various groups in the Middle East. And then the second area, very importantly, would be to push the IAEA, to push the Europeans to support this in the IAEA, the international organization charged with monitoring the nuclear agreement, to push them to insist on inspecting other sites that are not necessarily sites that have been declared nuclear sites. For example, military sites, conventional military sites. The United States has long wanted access to those in Iran. And so those are the avenues that the Trump administration sees possibilities for gaining more leverage vis-a-vis the Europeans and against Iran, to have an entirely new set of ground rules for how the United States works in the Middle East.
Tariq Raouf, can the Europeans be pushed on such issues, in your opinion? And what do you think the European response is going to be to all of this if Trump actually decertifies the deal? We have heard from the president, the French President Macron, who's saying that there's no alternative to the nuclear accord. So what do they do?
Well, just this morning, the European Union issued a statement saying that the Iran nuclear deal was the best way forward for a long-term solution of the Iranian nuclear file, and that all parties should abide by this agreement. If the Congress imposes new sanctions on Iran that are not nuclear-related, but these sanctions impact on European businesses extraterritorially, then the EU will have a problem and will need to decide whether they also pull out or whether they continue to maintain this deal and support their industries that are targeted by these extraterritorial sanctions by the U.S. If, however, Congress passes sanctions that are U.S.-specific and they do not penalize European businesses and banks, then we are in a different situation. But regardless, I think European businesses will feel the chill and would be very concerned about hefty fines being imposed on them, as has been done in the past.
So how much pressure is this going to put on European allies to get out of the deal?
Well, the Iran agreement is the single main accomplishment of the European Union as the union, so I think they will bat very hard to preserve this deal and also endeavor to continue its implementation, even if the U.S. Backs out of the deal. IAEA inspections continue in Iran under Iran's agreement with the IAEA pursuant to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And then there are supplemental inspections under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And the IAEA already has the authority under Iran's voluntary implementation of its additional protocol to seek access to sites that are not declared as nuclear. But there is a mechanism under which Iran can provide satisfaction to the IAEA's concerns short of providing access, and there is something called managed access under which Iran could accept IAEA visits to military sites for specific purposes, so to speak.
Fouad Ozadi, would you like to respond to my guest from Vienna, and also tell us, does this in any way, if the deal were to unravel, if Trump does decertify it and then Congress imposes sanctions, does this encourage Iran then to restart its nuclear program?
Yes, I think if the U.S. gets out of the nuclear agreement, it would be difficult for the Iranian government to stay in it, because after all, the major sanctions that we have are U.S. sanctions. And because of the snapback mechanism at the UN, U.S. will have the ability to bring the UN sanctions back as well. So this is not going to be acceptable for Iran. There are some people in Iran that are saying that Iran not only should get out of the nuclear agreement, Iran should get out of the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. because after all, being a part of NPT should have some benefits for the countries that have signed the agreement. And from the 1960s up to now, nobody can present any evidence that NPT has been good for Iran. So this is going to be something very serious for the future of Iran's nuclear program. Iran is not interested in making a nuclear weapon, but Iran does not want to be following Saddam Hussein in terms of allowing different inspectors, generally Western, generally some of them at least linked to intelligence services, to be visiting Iranian military sites. That's what Saddam did, and we remember what happened to him. So the idea is not only to get kind words from Europeans. What Iran wants from Europeans are concrete actions. For example, suing the U.S. Under WTO, passing legislations at EU, basically protecting EU companies that are dealing with Iran. These concrete actions actually can benefit Iranian politicians if they want to argue in terms of staying in the nuclear agreement. But if EU just goes along with the US, then I think the nuclear agreement is going to end.
Hilary Mann Leverett, in his speech to the UN General Assembly, that is, last month, Trump described it as one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the U.S. has ever entered into, and he calls it an embarrassment. Then at the same time, you have the Defense Secretary, James Mattis, who just recently, when asked whether he believed that the Iran deal was in the national interest of the country, he said, yes, I do. What do you make of these differing comments?
Well, in fact, I would go back just a little bit further to the Obama administration. Even though this agreement was hailed as a tremendous victory, the signature achievement of the Obama administration in foreign policy, even President Obama did not have the political will to submit this agreement to the Congress as a kind of treaty, which would bound the United States and any future administration. So we would not even be in this situation if President Obama had the political will to submit it to Congress. It would have bound future administrations. It would have been a binding agreement for the United States under international law. President Obama didn't do it because Congress wouldn't accept it. There has always been, I would call it a vocal but very well-funded and extreme part of the American policy elite that sees the U.S. invasion, for example, of Iraq and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, and even before that, as Professor Azadi was pointing out, the massive sanctions and sanctions mechanism that had been imposed on Iraq. They see all of that as successful because it brought down massive Iraqi Arab military power in the Middle East. They see that as a success. Never mind the people that died there, but they see that as a success. What's happening now is that same small group of people are now being essentially empowered, not just in Congress, but at the CIA, within the White House, to have influence over the U.S. policy direction. What's holding them back is not a group that presents an alternative, not a group that says, hey, we could work with the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's an important power. We can work with them where our interests overlap, and we could negotiate where they diverge. No, this alternate group says Iran is still a bad actor, but the United States must respect its agreements, and we can push Iran in other ways. That group is personified by Secretary of State Tillerson, Secretary of Defense Mattis, and probably National Security Advisor McMaster in the White House. So there is this debate. There is a conflict within the administration, but it's not a conflict between two real alternative views. It's basically a view that sees Iran as another target, like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and the other view that sees Iran still as a bad player, but can be undermined in other ways where the United States doesn't have to break its word in the nuclear agreement.
Well, a group that campaigns for the total ban of nuclear weapons has been now awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So the Nobel Committee said it wanted to honor the work done by the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, especially with the increased threat of nuclear conflicts. Listen.
We are sending messages, in fact, to all states, but also in particular to the nuclear weapon states, because it is a fact that states are in a different situation. The majority of the states of the world who have signed the ban treaty can do so without an immediate consequence on their armies, and they don't have to disarm, where, of course, nuclear states are in a different position. And we do realize that it has to be a slower process for them. But the message we are sending is to remind them of the commitment that they have already made, that they also are obliged to work for a nuclear-free world.
So that happened recently. Let's just broaden out the discussion for just a moment. Tariq Raouf, if America pulls out of this accord with Iran, what is the message there that is being sent to countries like North Korea, for example?
Well, I think the message, particularly to North Korea, would be that it's not worth making a deal with Washington because there is no certainty that the current government or a future government would abide by such an agreement. The international community of more than 122 states has sent a clear message by approving this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which has already been signed on the very first day that it opened for signature by more than 50 countries and already ratified by 3 of them. And as the Nobel Prize Committee chair was just mentioning in your clip, the 5 nuclear weapon states are already obligated under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to end the nuclear arms race and to work towards nuclear disarmament. With the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to this international campaign for the abolition of nuclear weapons, which represents a broad coalition in many different countries, it's a very clear message that nuclear weapons no longer play a role in today's international security challenges. Nuclear weapons are not useful in solving the problems in the Middle East, and nuclear weapons certainly are not useful in solving the issue with the North Koreans.
But Hilary Mann-Leverett, isn't there a bit of a double standard here when the focus is on Iran and now the threat is that the deal might unravel? And then you have countries, for example, Israel, who has nuclear capabilities, yet no one talks about that, especially in Washington.
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, even with Iran itself, before the revolution in 1979, the United States supported the Shah of Iran having not just a nuclear capability, but we supported his development of nuclear weapons. That's how this whole thing even starts in Iran, with the nuclear cooperation with the United States, because the United States wanted the Shah of Iran to have nuclear weapons, as we have supported Israel's acquisition of nuclear weapons. The double standards are far too many and too deep to recount.
Right.
But it's not just how the United States reacts to the Iran agreement. It's also what the United States did to Libya after Libya agreed to dismantle all of its nuclear and other weapons programs. But I think significantly, although it sends a very important message, the Nobel Peace Prize, to this organization, it's very important to keep reality where it is in terms of what's happening in Washington.
All
the
right.
idea that the United States would no longer use nuclear weapons is no longer there. There is now a discussion that the United States could actually use what they call tactical, precision-guided nuclear weapons to achieve goals. That's very much back on the table in Washington.
Fouad Aiziti, final word to you. Just tell us how much work Iran will put in to try and save this deal with the U.S. as well as with Europe. In just 30 seconds or so.
As Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, Ms. Mogherini, EU Foreign Policy Representative, and John Kerry were on the short list of the Nobel Peace Prize this year. This, I think, is an indication that there is actually a way of getting rid of nuclear weapons if you can get all these 3 parties agree on a nuclear agreement. And Iran has been asking for many years for a nuclear-free Middle East. And the people who have been opposing it are the hawkish elements in Washington that are in power, the Israeli government, and basically U.S. allies.
All right, leave it there. We thank you very much for joining us. To all of my guests, Fouad Aiziti, Hilary Mann-Leverett, and Tariq Raouf, thank you for speaking to us on Inside Story. And thanks for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.